Wilson Price Hunt from Trenton, New Jersey, was to eventually lead the American Fur Company's fur trapping operations at Astoria, at the mouth of the Columbia. He's known to be upright and fair, friendly, and accommodating, a reputation he'll live up to. He wasn't a seasoned hand in trading with the native tribes, never ventured deep into the wilderness on trading expeditions. But while doing business in St. Louis, he learned the ropes of trade secondhand, gaining knowledge of the tribes and the terrain from traders who ventured out. It was his task to lead an expedition to the mouth of the Columbia River by traversing vast rivers, endless plains, and the rugged slopes of the Rockies. Another partner, Donald McKenzie, joined Hunt on this expedition. He excelled where Hunt lacked, having spent 10 years deep in the wilderness with the Northwest Company. McKenzie prided himself on his woodcraft, his knack for Indian trade and strategy. He had the rugged spirit of the frontier and was known as a crack shot, enough to earn him quite the reputation. Together in late July 1810, Hunt and McKenzie headed to Montreal, the old hub of the fur trade, where they could get all they needed. First on the list was hiring a crew of Canadian voyageurs, that lot who typically loiter around the city. Now, a voyageur's a tricky character. Full of hidden tricks they are, one minute making the grandest promises, the next proving to be a real letdown. Plus, the Northwest Company, controlling Montreal, quietly barred their best hands from joining this new venture. So, despite generous terms, only the less than desirable showed up. But Hunt managed to gather enough to meet immediate needs and loaded up a supply of provisions, ammunition, and goods. They set off in one of those great canoes the traders used for navigating winding, unpredictable rivers. This one stretched 30 to 40 feet long and was several feet wide. Built from birch bark and spruce roots sealed with pine resin, it could hold over 4 tons, but was still light enough to be carried on men's shoulders at portages. A crew of 8 to 10 managed the canoe, led by 2 old hands stationed at bow and stern, foreman and steersman, keeping lookout and steering. The others paddled as middlemen. If the wind picked up, they could even raise a sail. They were ready, and the land journey was underway. The expedition took its regular departure, as usual, from St. Anne's, near the extremity of the island of Montreal, the great starting place of the traders to the interior. Here stood the ancient chapel of St. Anne, the patroness of the Canadian voyageurs, where they made confession and offered up their vows, previous to departing on any hazardous expedition. The shrine of the saint was decorated with relics and votive offerings hung up by these superstitious beings, either to propitiate her favor or in gratitude for some signal deliverance in the wilderness. It was the custom, too, of these devout vagabonds, after leaving the chapel, to have a grand carouse in honor of the saint and for the prosperity of the voyage. In this part of their devotions, the crew of Mr. Hunt proved themselves by no means deficient. Indeed, he soon discovered that his recruits, enlisted at Montreal, were fit to vie with the ragged regiment of Falstaff. Some were able-bodied but inexpert. Others were expert but lazy, while a third class were expert and willing but totally worn out, being broken-down veterans, incapable of toil. With this inefficient crew, he made his way up the Ottawa River and by the ancient route of the fur traders along a succession of small lakes and rivers to Michilimackinac. Their progress was slow and tedious. Mr. Hunt was not accustomed to the management of voyageurs, and he had a crew admirably disposed to play the old soldier and balk their work, and ever ready to come to a halt, land, make a fire, put on the great pot, and smoke and gossip and sing by the hour. It was not until the 22nd of July that they arrived at Mackinaw, situated on the island of the same name, at the confluence of Lakes Huron and Michigan. This famous old French trading post continued to be a rallying point for a multifarious and motley population. The inhabitants were amphibious in their habits, most of them being or having been voyageurs, or canoemen. It was the great place of arrival and departure of the Southwest fur trade. Here the Mackinaw Company had established its principal post, from whence it communicated with the interior and with Montreal. Hence, its various traders and trappers set out for their respective destinations about Lake Superior and its tributary waters, or for the Mississippi, the Arkansas, the Missouri, and the other regions of the West. Here, after the absence of a year or more, they returned with their peltries and settled their accounts. The furs rendered in by them being transmitted in canoes from hence to Montreal. Mackinaw was, therefore, for a great part of the year, very scantily peopled. But at certain seasons the traders arrived from all points with their crews of voyageurs, and the place swarmed like a hive. Mackinaw at that time was a mere village, stretching along a small bay with a fine broad beach in front of its principal row of houses, and dominated by the old fort which crowned an impending height. The beach was a kind of public promenade where were displayed all the vagaries of a seaport on the arrival of a fleet from a long cruise. Here voyageurs frolicked away their wages, fiddling and dancing in the booths and cabins, buying all kinds of knickknacks, dressing themselves out finely, and parading up and down like errant braggarts and coxcombs. Sometimes they met with rival coxcombs in the young Indians from the opposite shore, who would appear on the beach painted and decorated in fantastic style, and would saunter up and down, to be gazed at and admired, perfectly satisfied that they eclipsed their pale-faced competitors. Now and then a chance party of Northwesters appeared at Mackinaw from the rendezvous at Fort William. These held themselves up as the chivalry of the fur trade. They were men of iron, proof against cold weather, hard fare, and perils of all kinds. Some would wear the northwest button and a formidable dirk, and assume something of a military air. They generally wore feathers in their hats, and affected the brave. Je suis un homme du Nord. I am a man of the North, one of these swelling fellows would exclaim, sticking his arms akimbo and ruffling by the Southwesters, whom he regarded with great contempt, as men softened by mild climates and the luxurious fare of bread and bacon, and whom he stigmatized with the inglorious name of pork-eaters. The superiority assumed by these vainglorious swaggerers was, in general, tacitly admitted. Indeed, some of them had acquired great notoriety for deeds of hardihood and courage, for the fur trade had its heroes, whose names resounded throughout the wilderness. Such was Mackinaw at the time of which we are treating. It now, doubtless, presents a totally different aspect. The fur companies no longer assemble there. The navigation of the lake is carried on by steamboats and various shipping, and the race of traders and trappers and voyageurs and Indian dandies have vapored out their brief hour and disappeared. Such changes does the lapse of a handful of years make in this ever-changing country. At this place Mr. Hunt remained for some time to complete his assortment of Indian goods and to increase his number of voyageurs, as well as to engage some of a more efficient character than those enlisted at Montreal. And now commenced another game of jockeyship. There were able and efficient men in abundance at Mackinaw, but for several days not one presented himself. If offers were made to any, they were listened to with a shake of the head. Should anyone seem inclined to enlist, there were officious idlers and busybodies of that class who are ever ready to dissuade others from any enterprise in which they themselves have no concern. These would pull him by the sleeve, take him on one side and murmur in his ear, or would suggest difficulties outright. It was objected that the expedition would have to navigate unknown rivers and pass through howling wildernesses infested by savage tribes, who had already cut off the unfortunate voyageurs that had ventured among them, that it was to climb the Rocky Mountains and descend into desolate and famished regions, where the traveler was often obliged to subsist on grasshoppers and crickets, or to kill his own horse for food. At length one man was hardy enough to engage, and he was used like a stool pigeon to decoy others. But several days elapsed before any more could be prevailed upon to join him. A few then came to terms. It was desirable to engage them for 5 years, but some refused to engage for more than 3. Then they must have part of their pay in advance, which was readily granted. When they had pocketed the amount and squandered it in regals or in outfits, they began to talk of pecuniary obligations at Mackinaw, which must be discharged before they would be free to depart, or engagements with other persons, which were only to be canceled by a reasonable consideration. It was in vain to argue or remonstrate. The money advanced had already been sacked and spent, and must be lost and the recruits left behind, unless they could be freed from their debts and engagements. Accordingly, a fine was paid for one, a judgment for another, a tavern bill for a third, and almost all had to be bought off from some prior engagement, either real or pretended. Mr. Hunt groaned in spirit at the incessant and unreasonable demands of these worthies upon his purse. Yet with all this outlay of funds, the number recruited was but scanty, and many of the most desirable still held themselves aloof and were not to be caught by a golden bait. With these he tried another temptation. Among the recruits who had enlisted he distributed feathers and ostrich plumes. These they put in their hats, and thus figured about Mackinaw, assuming airs of vast importance, as voyageurs in a new company that was to eclipse the Northwest. The effect was complete. A French Canadian is too vain and mercurial a being to withstand the finery and ostentation of the feather. Numbers immediately pressed into the service. One must have an ostrich plume, another a white feather with a red end, a third a bunch of cock's tails. Thus all paraded about in vainglorious style, more delighted with the feathers in their hats than with the money in their pockets, and considering themselves fully equal to the boastful men of the North. While thus recruiting the number of rank and file, Mr. Hunt was joined by a person whom he had invited by letter to engage as a partner in the expedition. This was Mr. Ramsay Crooks, a young man, a native of Scotland, who had served under the Northwest Company and been engaged in trading expeditions upon his individual account among the tribes of the Missouri. Mr. Hunt knew him personally and had conceived a high and merited opinion of his judgment, enterprise, and integrity. He was rejoiced, therefore, when the latter consented to accompany him. Mr. Crooks, however, drew from experience a picture of the dangers to which they would be subjected, and urged the importance of going with a considerable force. In ascending the upper Missouri, they would have to pass through the country of the Sioux Indians, who had manifested repeated hostility to the white traders and rendered their expeditions extremely perilous, firing upon them from the river banks as they passed beneath in their boats, and attacking them in their encampments. Mr. Crooks himself, when voyaging in company with another trader of the name of M'Lellan, had been interrupted by these marauders, and had considered himself fortunate in escaping down the river without loss of life or property, but with a total abandonment of his trading voyage. Should they be fortunate enough to pass through the country of the Sioux without molestation, they would have another tribe still more savage and warlike beyond, and deadly foes of white men. These were the Blackfeet Indians, who ranged over a wide extent of country which they would have to traverse. Under all these circumstances, it was thought advisable to augment the party considerably. It already exceeded the number of 30, to which it had originally been limited, but it was determined, on arriving at St. Louis, to increase it to the number of 60. These matters being arranged, they prepared to embark, but the embarkation of a crew of Canadian voyageurs on a distant expedition is not so easy a matter as might be imagined, especially of such a set of vainglorious fellows with money in both pockets and cock's tails in their hats. Like sailors, the Canadian voyageurs generally preface a long cruise with a carouse. They have their cronies, their brothers, their cousins, their wives, their sweethearts, all to be entertained at their expense. They feast, they fiddle, they drink, they sing, they dance, they frolic and fight, until they are all as mad as so many drunken Indians. The publicans are all obedience to their commands, never hesitating to let them run up scores without limit, knowing that, when their own money is expended, the purses of their employers must answer for the bill, or the voyage must be delayed. Neither was it possible at that time to remedy the matter at Mackinaw. In that amphibious community there was always a propensity to wrest the laws in favor of riotous or mutinous boatmen. It was necessary also to keep the recruits in good humor, seeing the novelty and danger of the service into which they were entering, and the ease with which they might at any time escape it by jumping into a canoe and going downstream. Such were the scenes that beset Mr. Hunt, and gave him a foretaste of the difficulties of his command. The little cabarets and sutlers' shops along the bay resounded with the scraping of fiddles, with snatches of old French songs, with Indian whoops and yells, while every plumed and feathered vagabond had his troop of loving cousins and comrades at his heels. It was with the utmost difficulty they could be extricated from the clutches of the publicans and the embraces of their pot companions, who followed them to the water's edge with many a hug, a kiss on each cheek, and a maudlin benediction in Canadian French. It was about the 12th of August that they left Mackinaw and pursued the usual route by Green Bay, Fox, and Wisconsin rivers, to Prairie du Chien, and thence down the Mississippi to St. Louis, where they landed on the 3rd of September. St. Louis, which is situated on the right bank of the Mississippi River, a few miles below the mouth of the Missouri, was, at that time, a frontier settlement, and the last fitting-out place for the Indian trade of the Southwest. It possessed a motley population, composed of the Creole descendants of the original French colonists, the keen traders from the Atlantic States, the backwoodsmen of Kentucky and Tennessee, the natives and people of mixed race who call the prairies home, together with a singular aquatic race that had grown up from the navigation of the rivers, the boatmen of the Mississippi, who possessed habits, manners, and almost a language, peculiarly their own and strongly technical. They, at that time, were extremely numerous and conducted the chief navigation and commerce of the Ohio and the Mississippi, as the voyageurs did of the Canadian waters. But, like them, their consequence and characteristics are rapidly vanishing before the all-pervading intrusion of steamboats. The old French houses engaged in the Indian trade had gathered round them a train of dependents, mongrel Indians and mongrel Frenchmen, who had intermarried with Indians. These they employed in their various expeditions by land and water. Various individuals of other countries had, of late years, pushed the trade further into the interior, to the upper waters of the Missouri, and had swelled the number of these hangers-on. Several of these traders had, 2 or 3 years previously, formed themselves into a company composed of 12 partners with a capital of about $40,000 called the Missouri Fur Company, the object of which was to establish posts along the upper part of that river and monopolize the trade. The leading partner of this company was Mr. Manuel Lisa, a Spaniard by birth and a man of bold and enterprising character, who had ascended the Missouri almost to its source and made himself well acquainted and popular with several of its tribes. By his exertions, trading posts had been established in 1808 in the Sioux country and among the Arikara and Mandan tribes, and a principal one, under Mr. Henry, one of the partners, at the forks of the Missouri. This company had in its employ about 250 men, partly American and partly Creole voyageurs. All these circumstances combined to produce a population at St. Louis even still more motley than that at Mackinaw. Here were to be seen, about the river banks, the hectoring, extravagant, bragging boatmen of the Mississippi, with the gay, grimacing, singing, good-humored Canadian voyageurs. Vagrants of various tribes loitered about the streets. Now and then a stark Kentucky hunter in leathern hunting dress, with rifle on shoulder and knife in belt, strode along. Here and there were new brick houses and shops, just set up by bustling, driving, and eager men, of traffic from the Atlantic States, while, on the other hand, the old French mansions, with open casements, still retained the easy, indolent air of the original colonists, and now and then the scraping of a fiddle, a strain of an ancient French song, or the sound of billiard balls, showed that the happy Gallic turn for gaiety and amusement still lingered about the place. Such was St. Louis at the time of Mr. Hunt's arrival there, and the appearance of a new fur company, with ample funds at its command, produced a strong sensation among the eye traders of the place, and awakened keen jealousy and opposition on the part of the Missouri Company.